Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this virtual panel discussion, The Future of High-Tech Warfare. This is hosted by the brand new Forward Defense Initiative. That's the newest practice area in the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. It's a great lineup of speakers, and I'm not going to do the introductions fully, but I think David Ignatius will do that as moderator. But just to whet your appetite before I give you the context of Forward Defense, we have the newly minted author, and he's very much looking like an author today in his attire, and that's Christian Brose. Buy the book. Read it too if you want, but make sure to buy it. David Ignatius praised it in his column and for what it did, and we'll talk about that more later. We've got one of our most prominent board members, General Jim Cartwright. It's wonderful to have him here, the former Vice Chair of Joint Chiefs, Michelle Flournoy, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and then, of course, David, and I'm going to come back to his book, but buy his as well. It's also presses, one of the finest novelists I know, aside from his brilliant column, and a dear friend of many years from our days back to the Wall Street Journal. Let me just set up the Forward Defense context. It was designed to help the United States and its allies and partners contend with great power competitors and maintain favorable balances of power. This effort already has begun producing forward-looking, and they're always forward-looking, analyses of the trends, technologies, and operational concepts that will define the future of warfare and the alliance and deterrence postures needed for the 21st century. Last week, we released a major new report titled An Affordable Defense of Asia, in which retired Colonel T.X. Haases advances an offshore control strategy to mitigate Chinese military advantages and to improve the U.S. and allied warfighting and deterrent posture vis-a-vis China. The report's most important contribution is the novel operational concepts that employ emerging, relatively inexpensive technologies, multimodal missiles, long-range air drones, sea mines, unmanned naval vessels to support this strategy for an affordable defense of Asia. This follows our inaugural Forward Defense event on June 2nd titled War Stories from the Future. And we've done this kind of work for many years already, looking at fiction to help us find out what the future might look like. And we explored how narrative fiction can serve as an innovative methodology for helping us grasp the future of warfare. We were joined by General Cartwright again, who outlined imperatives for addressing future military challenges, as well as fiction authors Max Brooks and August Cole, and Marine Corps University's Colonel Valerie Jackson, and they all discussed the role of creative arts in enriching thinking about security and defense. To advance this mission, the Atlantic Council's convened now this panel discussion as the second event for this new Forward Defense Initiative. And this is featuring Chris Brose, Head of Strategy to Anduril Industries, and we knew each other, Chris, during your days at the Armed Services Committee, working with John McCain. We're on a couple of happy plane flights together during that period of time, among other engagements. Since we've been, we at the Council have made addressing great power competition one of the big bets that shape our work. And so his troubling conclusion in this book, that the U.S. is far less prepared to compete in great power competition than many of us assume, was really important. So I can think no one better to address the whole themes of our Future Address initiative. So joining Christian to advance this debate, as I said earlier, are Michelle Flournoy, General Cartwright, and David Ignatius. Before I turn to David, just a housekeeping note. This event is public, on the record. We encourage our audience on Zoom to ask questions for all of the panelists in the Q&A tab, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We'll be monitoring and collecting these questions, and we'll answer some of them toward the end of the event. It is a public event. Please be sure to identify your name and affiliation with each question you submit, which will help us. We encourage the audience to join the discussion on Twitter, AC Scowcroft, at AC Scowcroft, and using our hashtag Forward Defense. Before I turn to David, he's not going to have as big of a chance to promote his book on this event as Chris is. So here it is again. Paladin. I was at a book event with him hosted by Sally Quinn just a few days ago. Let me just read you the first paragraph, then I'll tell you what she said about it, because I think you should all go out and get this book. Actually, I've read not each and every one of his novels, but most of his novels, and my favorite character of all of them is in this book, and it's Michael Dunn. It starts at Michael Dunn's sentencing hearing at federal courthouse in Alexandria. The judge asked if he was sorry for his crimes. She said that Dunn had flagrantly ignored the Central Intelligence Agency's legal rules and lied about it. And worst of all, that he had violated the constitutional rights of others by running an intelligence operation against American journalists. Did he understand the seriousness of this offense? The First Amendment was first for a reason. Did he truly regret what he had done? Well, on Saturday, I started there, and halfway through the book, I finally fell asleep. It is a page turner. You got to get it. Or if you don't like that beginning, just remember what Sally Quinn told her audience just a few days ago, which was have great sex in it. So there you go. David, I turn over to you.
Well, my thanks to Fred. That's got to be my thanks to Fred. That's got to be the best book plug ever. And one reason we love the Atlantic Council and my friend Fred Kemp. So this topic of our conversation today, I think, is probably the most important defense issue before us. How to modernize our defense systems, how to procure the weapons that we need rather than continuing to procure the weapons that we have. We're lucky to have three people who in this area of defense modernization haven't just talked the talk, but have walked the walk. I'm going to just say a word about each of them in the order in which I'll ask them to make some introductory comments of 5 minutes or so. First, Chris Brose. His new book, The Kill Chain, as Fred said, is absolutely essential reading for anybody who wants to think carefully about the issues ahead. Chris was staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations, Senate Armed Services Committee, but he went on to be involved in trying to create these new weapons as the chief strategy officer for Anduril Industries. So I hope he'll talk to us about what it's like to try to build these weapons. General Cartwright, as vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was famous for his interest in new defense systems, new technologies, trying to help us think forward, not think backward. And Michelle Flournoy, in addition to her service as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, is now working to try to create an interface at her company, WestExec, between the companies that want to offer new technology, new ideas, and a Defense Department that's so often resistant to them. So let me turn first to Chris, and then I'll turn to General Cartwright, and then to Michelle, and then we'll have some questions. And do remember to put your own questions into the Q&A function, because at about 3 o'clock, we'll turn to those questions and ask our panel. So lead off, Chris.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Real pleasure to join you guys. And you've thought as much longer about all these topics than I have. So I'm just really honored to share the stage, or the virtual stage, with all of you. My book does not have any sex, David, so unfortunately I can't sort of tout it for those purposes. But I'm asked often, why I wrote it, and it's a question that I ask myself every single day that I was struggling through it. And ultimately, the bottom line for me is that in the decade that I spent working in the Senate and working for the Senate Armed Services Committee, I just became increasingly concerned about how America was stacking up against great power competitors, China primarily. My concern was I was watching what was a very methodical effort on the part of the Chinese Communist Party that has been ongoing for the better part of 3 decades to systematically build a military that is designed, purpose-built, to call into question the way that America has built its military and planned to project power overseas. The concern that I had watching this was that we were increasingly falling behind. We were not in the position that we needed to be. We were losing ground. We were not as attentive and aware of the threat that was gathering, the problems that we were facing as I felt we needed to be. I felt a disconnect between, I found the conversations that were happening in the Department of Defense. A lot of people were focused on these problems. Certainly Michelle, when she worked in the Pentagon, General Cartwright, when he worked in the Pentagon. But once you began sort of looking beyond that to the Congress, to the American people, there was just not a recognition that we face these problems, and the situation had become sort of as perilous as I believe that it has. To be very clear, I'm not saying that China's 10 feet tall. I am saying that for 25 to 30 years, they have been building a military, putting the pieces together to undermine how America projects power. And they've made a lot more progress than I think most Americans realize. And at that same time, I think we have become so enamored of the way we have operated, the tools and weapon systems that we have used to operate, that have sort of delivered our dominance in this post-Cold War era, that we have really not focused as much on what we need to do to prepare for the future. There are a lot of other reasons, the events after 9/11 that sort of contributed to that. But by and large, we now have a military, I think, that is increasingly facing a challenger in China, where our competitive sort of military advantage is eroding, our technological advantage is eroding. And when you look to the future in terms of what the fiscal situation is going to be in the aftermath of COVID, defense spending was already turning down, and I think it's going to turn down pretty considerably for as far into the future as I feel comfortable predicting. So, what ultimately I think was a problem that we really needed to face up to before this latest crisis, I think is now something that we just can't afford to turn away from. And in terms of how we need to think differently about how emerging technologies can contribute to solving these problems differently, building different kinds of military forces, operating them differently. This is very much, I think, where we have to put our effort, especially as defense resources start to dry up. So I look forward to the conversation today. I'll stop there, and very eager for the discussion.
Thank you, Chris. And let me turn now to General Cartwright for what I promised will be a high-level assessment of these very, very serious problems. General Cartwright.
Thank you, David. Anytime you look into the future, the one thing you can be certain of is that you'll be wrong. And so, with a grain of salt here, when I look at the current force, some of the attributes that I think probably have to get addressed in short order, and probably for the most part are being addressed in one way or another. The first is that we have to reposition every time there is a threat that pops up, and it takes days and weeks. And so whether it's somebody crossing a border, seizing an island, we are there weeks after it's occurred in the current construct, and it's putting us at a huge disadvantage. Second, we're unable to persist for long periods of time on short order combat activities. And what we would call in the military our combat load, but in other words, the bullets that we have with us are usually insufficient, and the exchange ratios, we pay hundreds of millions of dollars per round, and we're shooting at $10,000 targets. The exchange ratios are not good, and we've got to figure out a way to come to grips with that. We have a tremendous, and this was really pointed out very well by Chris, we have a tremendous over-reliance on capital assets, large ships, large aircraft, et cetera, that put us in a position of never being in the right place at the right time. And the last is that in this discussion is that we have relied on the sanctuary of geography for so many years, and it's just not real now. Two oceans do not protect the United States anymore. Mountain ranges don't protect countries anymore. They're just not the sanctuary that offer the sanctuary that they did at one time. So when I look at those problems, I have just kind of 2.5 attributes that I would push on for this conversation. The first one is we have to find a way back to the value of mass. we have to find a way to be able to mass fires, to mass forces, etc. And we have to be able to do it on a timeline that's fundamentally different than the past. Seeking coherent fires and virtual fires and a way to bring kinetic and virtual fires together and integrate them in a way that is coherent is absolutely essential. And we're working in that direction, but we are not even close to getting there. The disaggregation of our forces is going to be essential. Disaggregation of forces, basings, logistics, etc. The ability to use the space analogy right now, if I want a communication system that is space-based, I'm talking about maybe 10 platforms. Think about something more realistic like 4,000. We don't have the mass that we need, and 10 is an easy target. 4,000's next to impossible to attack. And it's that kind of thought process that's got to change. And in essence, for kind of my background in aircraft and whatnot, we've got to transition from crews per platform to platforms per crew. That just has to happen. We can't get to mass any other way. The second is maneuver. So you see the theme here, mass and maneuver. But maneuver is the ability to close the threat with the operationally compelling mass in a short period of time. And today that's measured in days and weeks. The reality of the world that we live in is it's got to move to milliseconds and nothing longer than an hour to get where we need to be with compelling force. If we can't do that, we're pretty much irrelevant. And we've got to be able to cross the domains. We hear a lot in the verbiage from the Pentagon and others about cross-domain. Integrated domain fires and the ability to move from one domain to the other and transition very quickly and to have that be coherent is absolutely essential to anything that we're going to do. Coherence is the application of mass and maneuver in a way that is totally integrated, not scheduled, not deconflicted, but integrated. And we're not there yet in command and control. In the maneuver, we've got to expand the maneuver space. Today, the maneuver space goes from about 22,000 miles off the planet to about 6 miles below the ocean. That's the maneuver space that we've got to operate in. In addition to that maneuver space is the electromagnetic spectrum. And right now, we treat that as kind of some fixed activity. If we don't start maneuvering in the electromagnetic spectrum with cyber, with an electronic attack, etc., we will be outmaneuvered every time, long before we get to the conflict. And the last piece here, which I kind of count the half because it just depends on your perspective, but the department and much of the rhetoric and writing right now is talking about the concept of swarm, which for me is the coherent application of mass and maneuver. So it's either part of mass and maneuver or it's a separate activity. I don't know how that'll all work out over time. But at the end of the day, we've got to be able to move in an agile and quick way and get into decision loops that are measured in milliseconds, not weeks and days. And these are areas where I can go down and talk to the eaches of particular systems. But overall, getting mass, reacquiring mass, getting maneuver that is up there in the high end of the spectrum of the speed of light, Mach 20 plus, is really where we have to start to move, and coordinating those activities in a way that today we're just not doing are all areas we have to focus on. Thank you, David.
Let me turn now to Michelle Flournoy, and then we'll come back for some discussion. Don't forget to put your own questions in the Q&A function. Michelle.
Great. Well, thanks so much to Fred and Barry and the Atlantic Council for convening a great discussion, and to Chris for writing a really important book that sort of sounds the alarm that, the United States is at risk of losing its military technological advantage vis-a-vis great powers like China. And the planned force that DoD has is insufficient to deter or defeat Chinese aggression in the future. It's really, when you think about that, it's difficult to overstate the catastrophic consequences of a United States that could no longer credibly protect its interests or its allies or partners in the very region that will be most important to our future prosperity and security. We've all talked about the national defense strategy, starting in Obama, continuing into this administration, the shift towards great power competition. But that conceptual shift really hasn't been matched by a requisite realignment of concepts, culture, and service programs and budgets. So DoD has been talking a much better game than it's actually been playing. Reversing this trend is going to take real leadership and making this sharpening our edge a top priority for the department. So let me go through a few recommendations that basically build out the argument that the next administration is going to have to take, whatever it stripes, will have to take much bigger, bolder steps to accelerate the development and the adoption of new operational concepts and capabilities that will be essential to keeping our edge and underwriting our ability to deter a great power. So let me start with some recommendations. The first really center on leadership. I think, the next secretary will have to make accelerating the fielding of these capabilities to safeguard the U.S. military's edge the department's top investment priority. I think this is going to require a much more refined articulation of the big bets that the department wants to place. What are the key areas of investment that we need to make to keep our edge? And I'll nominate a couple of examples. I don't know that these are the right ones, but I think it's a really important debate to have, and that the department's very clear on where it's going to make large multi-year investments to try to sharpen our edge. First, a secure, resilient C4ISR network of networks that's capable of actually supporting the kinds of operations that General Cartwright was describing in a very hostile anti-access area denial environment. Second, AI-enabled decision support to ensure that commanders and operators can make decisions better and faster than the adversary. Third, fleets of integrated autonomous systems that can team with manned platforms to perform critical functions while reducing the need to put service members at risk in the most lethal environments. Fourth, dramatically increasifying and diversifying long-range precision fires to complicate and overwhelm adversary attack planning. Fourth, manned and unmanned logistic solutions that support the more distributed force that General Cartwright was talking about. And fifth, defensive cyber, electronic, and kinetic capabilities that meaningfully improve our survivability and combat effectiveness. Now, again, whether those are the right bets, I think we can have a good debate, but we need to identify what those bets are, put serious effort and money into them, and attract industry to help us realize the art of the possible there. The other leadership dimension is really choosing and empowering a team of leaders who are capable of and committed to delivering on this effort as the department's priority. I think this will take considerable senior leader time and bandwidth. And I think there's some good models from the past, such as the Advanced Capabilities and Deterrence panel that was around when Secretary Hagel asked the Deputy Secretary, then Bob Work, and the Vice Chairman to really focus efforts on advancing and implementing the third offset strategy. I think something akin to that needs to be revived to move us forward. The other thing I'd say is the importance of, we tend to get very technology focused very quickly. I think where the real long pole in the tent is actually concept development, and that requires wargaming and experimentation. So we need a much more integrated, mutually reinforcing, iterative approach to developing fundamentally new concepts for how we're going to fight, wargaming those, testing them, taking prototypes of new capabilities, experimenting with them, having the insights and the lessons learned from that come back in to influence requirements definition and again, refine the concepts. So this is going to take more resources and more brain power, both from OSD and the services, to get to the kind of new deterrence and warfighting concepts that we need to be successful in the future. As Chris mentioned, the department's going to have to embrace the imperative to make hard choices in a flat or declining budgetary environment. There's some very difficult trade-offs that will have to be made to create room in the program and budget for investment in some of the key emerging technologies that will ultimately determine our success in the future security environment. We are still, as Chris argued, very much overinvested in legacy platforms and underinvested in the kinds of capabilities that will give us the range and survivability and resilience and lethality that we will need to be combat effective in a future A2AD environment. So there are a number of things we could talk about, what that will require, but it will certainly require a really careful scrub of all the major defense acquisition programs and some very hard discussions about where to accept and manage a degree of risk, not only in programs, but in geographies and operations. I think the department needs to double down on increasing and incentivizing funding for innovation, whether that's traditional S&T spending or R&D spending. We can talk about that in more detail. The Defense Science Board has made some really helpful recommendations there. And I think we need some help from Congress to give us some more the department more flexibility in bridging what I call the valley of death. I know Chris has used this term as well. We're really good at finding new technologies and commercial companies that can come in and demonstrate a new capability, prototype something. But then there's this valley of death that very few of them cross to get to an actual source of recurring revenue in a program of record. I think there are a number of ideas that we can explore to bridge that valley of death going forward. Last two recommendations is we need to recruit, train, and develop and keep a much more tech-savvy workforce, both civil and military. Obviously, we will still rely on industry for a lot of the engineering work, but we need a more tech-savvy workforce to help to understand how technology can change concepts, to oversee programs, to do the test and evaluation, to do all of the functions that the department needs to be able to do. And that will require, I think, retraining and re-incentivizing some part of our acquisition core to really understand and be focused on software-driven systems and emerging technologies rather than building large-scale hardware. And lastly, all of this, and maybe Chris can speak to this more, we have to build greater trust and support in Congress and reimagine the relationship. We have to get Congress to be more comfortable letting DoD take some near-term risk, to support DoD when it makes the hard choices to make the necessary investments in the future. And that will require really building transparency and buy-in and bringing Congress much more inside the tent in the department to get them on board for the urgent and important changes that need to be made. So let me stop there.
So thanks, Michelle. I want to turn to each of the panelists for a couple of questions from me, and then we'll turn to the audience and your questions. Let me start with Chris. Chris, to follow on Michelle's last point, in your book, you talk about the military-industrial congressional complex, that sort of iron triangle that is the biggest factor that I can see in keeping these legacy weapon systems at the top of our spending, even if they're not at the top of our needs. You've seen that close up as Senator McCain's staff director on the Senate committee. Speak for a minute about how we begin to get the political weight to make these changes.
Yeah, so the military-industrial congressional complex was a term that Senator McCain liked to use. I think it was originally maybe Eisenhower's. But I think the idea here is just that the defense establishment is very much those three stakeholders. You can't imagine making these decisions without one element of that involved. And I think the challenge that we've had for a very long time is that this has become a very closed system. It's become very kind of stuck in the ways that it's built things, how it's gone about that, the types of systems that it's relied upon. And the nature of this challenge is that it's very difficult to change that process. And I think, the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that we're not just going to kind of hand wave it away. You're still going to have members of Congress who have vested interests in legacy programs. You're still going to have military services that are reluctant to give away things that have defined them, that they have become very confident in for a very long period of time. And obviously, industry responds to incentives. I think the thing that we need to do is just that. We need to think about how we systematically begin changing the incentives that govern our defense establishment. For too long, those incentives have led us to produce the very kinds of things that we have become overly reliant upon, and produce them in the same ways that we, have become used to producing them. The only way we're going to change that is to begin creating fundamentally different incentives for how the department experiments with capability, how they bring new technology in, to Michelle's point, learn how they can solve new problems with them, rapidly develop prototypes, get them out, and then find the best ones that are working, identify winners, pick winners, and try to begin to scale that. I think, to Michelle's point, bringing Congress along in that process so that they understand the risks that are being taken, the ways that the department is working to solve these problems differently, and really beginning to create more of a body of evidence of what's working and what isn't, so that you can compete capabilities on a level playing field, regardless of who's producing them. Again, focusing, as I try to argue in the book, on the things we're actually trying to achieve, on the outcomes we're trying to achieve, in improving human understanding, decision making, action. Ultimately, I think if the Congress and the department can get sort of more onto one page in that respect, begin scaling more rapidly systems that are proving out to be successful, you can begin to see industry respond to those incentives. I think for too long we've had an over-reliance upon a certain kind of industry, and a lot of other new entrants have sought to do work and have just never had the opportunity to kind of bridge that valley of death. They haven't been able to survive the timelines that it's taken to do work on traditional processes. We've got to start chipping away at that. And I think you will see that there's a lot of interest out in the technology community to do this work. There is a lot of excitement about supporting national defense. There's a lot of desire to do the work, notwithstanding, kind of the protestations you hear out of elements and places in Silicon Valley. The challenge is that we've made it so hard, it's returned so little, and the timelines on which it's required to do this work, have really kept a lot of companies from getting involved in the first place, and it's kept investors from making those investments. This is something that I think we need to begin changing. It's not going to happen overnight, but systematically re-engineering those incentives, I think, is the best way to begin moving this transition in the direction it needs to go.
Haas, let me ask you a question that's again drawn from the arguments that Chris has made in his book. Part of the power of the kill chain is he describes the difficulties the United States would have with its current forces in a major conflict with China. I've heard you talk about what the first minutes and hours of a war with China would look like. Maybe you could share a little bit of that with this audience. And just to add one more thing, be very interested in how you think General Berger is faring with his unusually direct efforts to get the Marine Corps, your former service, to move into the future decisively, stop thinking about its legacy missions, think about different ones. Haas.
Thanks, David. It is difficult that the technology side of the equation, quite frankly, is the easy side of the equation. It's the cultures. It is the legacy thought process oftentimes, and how we approach the problems that Chris and Michelle have highlighted. And so when you look at these problems, how do you move mass to a place where there is no ground on which to stand? It's only ocean for the most part. How do you move long distances with great amounts of power? And how do you compel before there's a conflict such that you're deterring the conflict when it eventually breaks out, if it has to? And so, to me, these concepts that are being discussed, and the ones I just kind of laid out in massive maneuver, start to get at these issues, start to create conceptual space in which to work with them. The technologies are coming. They're not all here right now, but we're starting to understand them, and we are moving in directions that to me, make a lot of sense. But you have to start to look at the fact that our reach and our ability to move mass large distances right now is greatly hindered. If you pick the service and you pick the platform, if I say to service X, I have a problem I need to solve, when they turn to that group of companies, it is a platform solution that you get. And it's a 15-year development cycle with a 15-year production cycle behind it. And then you have that platform for 30 to 50 years, and it gets upgraded 2 or 3 times. That's not competitive. It's not going to be competitive. Granted a public forum, but if you're happy buying a car and not having it improved for 2 or 3 years until you buy your next one, the car I'm driving gets updated every 2 or 3 weeks. It's a fundamentally different game and world that we're living in. And we've got to figure out how to bring that to national security. Chris absolutely, knocks it out of the park on talking about how hard this is going to be. But the question is, what do we want to do with our security as we go forward? And if we want to feel secure, be secure, 1, there are no perfect solutions. 2, the competitive landscape changes in hours and days, not weeks, months, and years. And the platforms that we carry to battle have got to be able to do that. And they're not going to do that in hardware. They're going to do that in software, in processing power, in high power communications. Those are the things that are going to drive the landscape of the battle of the future. And it's going to start down at the non-kinetic end, and it's going to escalate up through until it stops to the high end of conflict. And it's going to go very, very fast. Decision time and decision quality are going to be the differentiators in win and lose. And if we can't get decision time and quality out of our systems, then we're disadvantaged. And when I talk to that, look at the financial sector probably is the best example. You can earn billions of dollars for a 200 millisecond advantage in a financial transaction action. Okay, that's the kind of thought process that has to go into command and control and ISR, et cetera, of forces, fires, et cetera. And we're just not quite there yet on that thought process. The systems are there, but the cultures are not quite there yet. They're not thinking about it that way. They're not thinking about being competitive in that environment. The high ground today is the gravity separation between the moon and the earth. That's the high ground. That's where we have to be looking down. And we've got to be able to work at that high ground at the speed of gaming, under 100 milliseconds delay. You would not accept your cell phone having 100 millisecond delay. Today, we accept seconds, even minutes of delay in communications. That just can't happen. We've got to change that stuff. And so the beginning of the conflict, if it were to happen today, we'd be at huge disadvantage. We'd win, but we'd be at a disadvantage. Like Michelle's comments, I mean, I look at Berger and I look at the Marine Corps and what's happening there, but all of the services, the good news, I don't know that I've ever seen a better chairman and vice chairman pair than what we have right now for this kind of an environment. And I think you have 4 service chiefs who really are ready to do it. The hard news is, how do they get the culture to move? How do you get the Iron Majors to move in a direction, the vested interests on the Hill to move in a direction that will advantage us at a speed that's going to keep us competitive?
So let me close this portion of our conversation with a quick question for Michelle, and then we'll turn to some terrific questions that have come in from the audience. Michelle, I'm curious, in your current job with West Exec, where you're trying to help small companies across that valley of death so they can do business with the Pentagon, what do you tell them? What advice do you give that startup entrepreneur who wants to be selling to the Pentagon, but just thinks it's just too hard?
Well, since I think it's so important to our national security, I spend a lot of time trying to convince them to stay in the game. I think generally they do need help navigating, the Pentagon and all the different stovepipes and so forth. What we try to do is help them with strategies that can accelerate their travel across the valley of death. Right now, that is, also pursuing commercial business that gives them some additional revenue while they're kind of waiting for the slower times of DoD. Sometimes it's helping them when they have success in one stovepipe or one service, helping them find others who would also like to invest in them and develop prototypes in other services or other contexts. And then right now, a lot of times it's helping them find partners, larger companies that already have existing contract vehicles, existing relationships that can bring them in as a subcontractor and get them, get the DoD customer more familiar with the smaller company until they're in a position to compete as a prime directly themselves. But what's really needed is some bridging authority from Congress and some portfolio management authority. And what I mean by that is you can have a company literally win a number of prototype contests and be told, we want you, you're the one we want to buy, and we're going to compete, have the competition coming, but you have to wait till the next budget cycle when we can fit you in. So that's a 12 to 18 month gap where they're sitting there waiting. And a small company, that's an exercise in survival. So I think actually having some kind of money that's not new start money, but would allow some bridging to further prototype and refine requirements until they get to that production requirement would be helpful. The other thing is enabling the services to do portfolio management, which right now Congress pretty much prohibits. We need, to Haases' point, things are constantly changing. We need to empower people to look across a mission portfolio and saying, okay, this investment is starting to really bear fruit. This one isn't working, so we're going to stop that and move money from that over here. So a much greater program authority, reprogramming authority within portfolios so that the department can really manage their investments in these emerging technologies much more intelligently and more effectively.
So thank you, Michelle. And let's turn now to questions from the audience, starting off with a particularly provocative one from Yoichi Kato to Chris Brose, asking it as a Japanese member of the audience. The question asks, U.S. allies like Japan still depend on U.S. military primacy for their defense strategy. If, quote, and these are quotes from your recent Wall Street Journal op-ed piece, if, quote, recovering U.S. global military primacy is no longer a practical goal, close quote, and the United States, quote, must instead pursue a more limited and achievable goal denying military dominance to China, how should the allies redefine the role of the United States in their defense strategy? Great question for Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to get past the idea that sort of sustaining primacy or recovering primacy is going to be realistic for us, or that it's frankly necessary. I think that we can achieve our national defense objectives in the absence of the kind of military dominance that we've had for the past 3 decades. I think this is going to require us, as we're talking about here, to do a lot of things very differently. And it's going to require our allies and partners to do a lot of things differently. I don't think that any ally or partner should think that this is, somehow, that they should essentially write America out of how they're thinking about their own national defense. In much the same way that I think for us, we are going to become more dependent upon allies and partners in the future as we think about how we balance Chinese power, balance Russian power. We, I think, all too often have not done nearly enough to empower our allies and to focus on the things that are actually going to make us, a greater team or a greater partnership. We have, consciously withheld technology transfer, weapons sales that would make our allies more capable. And then we, kind of voice our frustration at the fact that our allies aren't capable enough. We focus too much on how much our allies are spending and not enough on what they're spending their actual resources on in terms of military capabilities that are going to be complementary, interoperable to the ones that we're developing. And to Michelle's point, really thinking of this holistically as how we put together a multilateral defense strategy where we understand what is expected of each other. I think for U.S. allies and partners, this should be something that they welcome. This should not be seen as America walking away from them. This should not be seen from them as something that's going to require them to go it alone. Now, I think that unfortunately for the past few years, we've had a lot of decisions coming out of Washington that have left that impression on allies. That's something that we fundamentally need to change and recognize that our allies and partners are going to be indispensable to America's ability to defend our interests in the future. The kind of basing access, the kind of dependencies that we're going to develop in terms of technology and capabilities. To Haases' point about mass, I talk a lot in the book about the importance of mass, and one sure way to enhance mass is by multiplying it across allies and partners who bring similar capabilities to bear, whether they're autonomous systems or longer range fires or just ubiquitous sensors. These are things that we need to think about differently, I think, than the way we've thought about them in the past, where we've been top of the heap and we really haven't thought meaningfully about how to integrate allies and partners into how we think about deterrence and warfighting. I think that this is something we can do. I think it's going to be something we have to do. But I also believe that in a world where primacy is eroding, where we're not going to get it back, we can nonetheless create sort of a defense or a strategy of defense in the absence of dominance that nonetheless allows us to take care of our core interests as well as the people, places, and things in the world that are essential to America, and play that role for our allies and partners that we have for many decades as far as keeping the peace, sustaining global stability in a way that benefits all of us.
So as you respond to that, it's obvious that's one of the most interesting conversations we should be having with our allies. What is it that they should begin to think about doing themselves? As you say, not a dollar or percentage figure, but specific missions. Here's a question for General Cartwright from James M. Hassick. To free up money for investing in all these distributed network mass effect systems, what should the Defense Department stop buying?
Always a challenge and always one of the tougher questions. From my perspective, if you look at the exchange, we had this conversation many times when Michelle and I were in the department. But giving up a frontline fighter like the F-35, reducing the numbers there, the swap is almost a 10-to-1 swap. So you can buy 10 autonomous systems for every one of those fighters that you give up. So the question is, how much of the capital assets do we really need to do what and where, and how much of that we can free up in decisions that we work our way through from the standpoint of modeling, simulation, war gaming, et cetera, to come up with it. And that is the question that the service chiefs are really, really focused in on right now. Now, once they make a decision on what it is they can trade and what they're willing to give up, getting that through the valley of death, so to speak, and getting it through the constituencies is almost harder than coming to the decision. And it takes a long time. And that's the part that's so difficult. And the flexibility we'd like to have to make some of those trades, when you look at platforms that have been around for a very long time and we're unwilling to give up because of one constituency or another, it's, you're going to make 10 enemies for every good decision you make. And it's really, really tough. And so my sense here is that's going to be hard. I'd like to tip also right back to where Chris was on this type of conversation. Is one point is we've got to start thinking about what we can do for our allies as we go forward. And we've had this construct of the Five Eyes for a long time, where we share intimately everything that we know as much as we can back and forth. We have to look at whether or not Five Eyes ought to be a broader construct than what it is today. Because if we're going to trust each other, we're going to have to be forward with what we can exchange between each other in knowledge and in systems.
So I have a question here for Michelle Flournoy from David Hammond, professor at the University of Mary Washington. To your points, where's the future workforce to address your recommendations coming from? Efforts to overhaul the U.S. government national security workforce seem to have stalled. And let me add on a question of my own, Michelle. One of the interesting things to me about the Space Force, as people have begun to try to think about it, is that it would be in significant part a hybrid force. It would have a lot of reserve officers, people who'd be commissioned right in as lieutenant colonels and colonels who have the technical mastery in space systems. So think with us about this question. Where do we get the people to make these new high-tech systems really go?
So it's a multifaceted answer, but I think the first thing is you have a lot of military personnel who are already in the system, whether they were service academy grads or ROTC, who have STEM degrees. And yet the personnel management system doesn't allow them to be technologists and have a promising career path or promotion path to get to general officer in their own services. So we could dramatically improve our tech talent tomorrow if we simply created career paths that would promote and reward the tech talent that's already, resident inside the service and really allow them to fully realize that talent. Similarly, you have a lot of folks who have a lot of tech aptitude, and the prospect of upskilling people who are already in the force is very promising. I apologize for my dog joining in the conversation. So in addition, and same can be true said on the civilian side, a lot of possibility for upskilling and creating career paths that really keep technically inclined people. But we also need to open up the soda straws of, tech talent coming in from industry or from universities. We do have some debt forgiveness programs, scholarship programs, but right now they're cyber focused and it's maybe tens or dozens a year. We need to open that up and have it be a much broader set of tech skills and to do it at scale. I think there's a lot of interest in industry and being able to have not only junior talent coming in, but having rotations of senior folks coming through. And then there's some initiatives that are starting to happen there. But lastly, I would say there's also in the incentive structure, it's not just getting the people and figuring out career paths. For something like acquisition, you really have to change what's rewarded in the acquisition core. Going from a very risk-averse culture that focuses primarily on cost and avoiding cost and schedule overruns for major platforms, and that's understandable. We like that. To really training a cadre, almost like a special, the Green Berets of acquisition that are really expert in agile, secure software development, agile, secure development of emerging technologies, and who are incented to take some risk to learn and improve and to work the cycle very, very quickly. That's what it's going to take. It's about training those people and rewarding those people. And it can be done. It's not, impossible.
So I want to ask Chris a question combining the two similar ones that came in from Eric Garsky and Alex Casindino, asking basically, do we have too broad a set of commitments in our national security posture now? The way Alex puts it, what situations and threats are most concerning for our military moving forward? The 2019 Worldwide Threat Assessment had dozens of threats mentioned, but these were not prioritized. I think this is a question that people who support Donald Trump ask all the time, well, why do we have so many commitments when we're not exactly flush with money to support our own needs? What if you take a whack at that, Chris?
Yeah, I think that for many years now, I think the United States has had too many extracurricular activities. I think one of the things that we all have to recognize as we talk about the reemergence of great power competition, et cetera, is that great power competition necessarily requires prioritization. We talk about divesting of legacy programs, which we're going to have to. We're also going to have to divest of some missions, things that we have taken on, things that we have been doing for a very long time, as part of this effort to focus on the things that we're absolutely going to have to do and do well for the future. If we say we want to prioritize the reestablishment of conventional deterrence with China, great power competition in that vein, we are going to have to necessarily do less of other things. And that's going to be a very difficult discussion, just as difficult as the question that General Cartwright was asked: what are you going to not buy? A question that policymakers are going to have to answer for our military is, what are we also not going to do? And that's something that is going to be challenging. But I also think we need to think creatively about the answers to those problems as well. And I think just as we've talked about emerging technologies and new operational concepts, there are ways that we can solve these traditional problems that we've had, whether it's counterterrorism or instability. We can solve these problems differently without being so completely reliant upon, incredibly manpower intensive, incredibly resource intensive solutions that we have fielded for many decades now. And I think here too, the kinds of technologies, capabilities, operational concepts that we're talking about in this discussion are equally applicable to what I would consider to be lesser priority missions, as we focus on deterrence vis-a-vis China, Russia. These are things that we're going to have to wrestle with and think through, but I also think there are ways that we can continue to address enduring interests that we're going to have, albeit not in the way that we have become accustomed to over the past 2 to 3 decades.
I have a last question for Michelle from Lendert van Bochoven. What are recommendations from you or from General Cartwright about the basic procurement and acquisition process? Let me put it more bluntly. Is our procurement process at the Pentagon so broken that we need to fundamentally do it a different way? Just this model that's grown up, it's so accreted with rules and regulations that only the biggest players really can get in. Is it time to think about throwing that one overboard, Michelle?
Well, I do think there's a lot of room for improvement, and I would actually start with the requirements definition process. We have a process that literally takes years usually to upfront try to define the requirements of the capability we're seeking to the nth degree, and set that in stone as the front end of an acquisition process. I think that for emerging technologies that are new, that are continuing to evolve, that's simply the wrong paradigm. So I think that is an area where we need to think about how to do that differently and allow the requirements to be informed by a more agile development process and the trade-offs between cost and capability that we discover along the way of that. In terms of major acquisition, I mean, there are certain parts of the system that do work to try to keep, costs contained and keep things on schedule. But again, to General Cartwright's point, I mean, how do you create an open system architecture that allows, when we do field a new destroyer or a new cruiser or a new aircraft, that allows you to actually put new capability on that platform on a regular basis through open mission architecture, through software upgrades, through modular systems that plug and play. Again, it takes a different approach, but I would, maybe defer to General Cartwright to see if he has any brilliant ideas on exactly how to get this to happen.
Haas, over to you for last thoughts.
Some of this is like learning to sleep faster. I think probably the area that I'm most sensitive to and most important to me is the requirements definition activity. And I don't disagree with Michelle. For me, it is defining what the first principles are and tying that to your strategy, and then creating a correlation between everything you do and how much it improves that strategy and those metrics associated with that strategy. That's where we really need to get to, because right now it is a lot of paper and a lot of requirements down to the nth degree, and it gives you no room to expand or grow or take advantage of a world that lives in Moore's law, not in 15-year cycles. And so, to me, bringing the requirements system in a direction that is more definitive about what are the strategies that the nation is pursuing, and how do we lay those strategies out in a way that there are benchmarks and performance that we are chasing, objectives and real, and to start to think about the system that way. That way, if the ship that we build, we put out, but then we say it's got to be able to, and it's got to be able to do that and keep pace with technology. And if it cannot innovate with the pace that's necessary to compete, it needs to leave, and we need to get a different ship. But today, for me, I did my first cruise on Nimitz. Nimitz is still in the fleet 50 years later.
Wow. Well, that's a good way to conclude our discussion about the old world and the new. There isn't any more important defense issue than the one we've discussed. It was a wonderful set of comments by our panel. I want to thank the people who arranged this, starting with Fred Kemp, who leads the Atlantic Council, and working with Fred, Barry Pavel, Mark Massa, and Clem Starling from the Scowcroft Center. Thanks to everybody for joining us today, and we'll look forward to continuing this series.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Everybody.